Well, welcome everyone. In our discussion today, we'd like to focus on science and the public, focus on roadblocks to science education, and maybe some solutions that our distinguished panelists can suggest for overcoming those roadblocks. But first, let's ask a question I think all of us are already on the same page about, but we're anticipating that these discussions will reach a much wider audience. Let's begin with the question, why science? When Annie was on Point of Inquiry, it should be said that all the panelists have been on the radio show, the podcast. She seemed to have the audacity to suggest that science was for everyone. So the question is, why should someone in our society be into science? Does the public really need to understand the methods of science, the body of knowledge that we call science, in order to kind of be good citizens? How does that cash out? So let's begin with Andrea.
Thank you, DJ. Well, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One, I want to address something that was said by the earlier panel, they did such a great job and were so stimulating and witty. But when Wendy Kaminer asked about how, science isn't for everyone because we don't all have that predisposition or that aptitude to grasp some of these ideas, it immediately occurred to me that that is really our job. It's to reach the widest possible public. This is a great legacy of Carl Sagan, who wouldn't write any mind off, and who, as we all know, took a huge amount of abuse from the scientific community for doing so. He was absolutely committed to reaching out, to speaking and writing in crystalline, clear words, never resorting to jargon or to mystification, because for my money, science is the greatest engine of demystification the world has ever seen. And that's its greatness. And I do believe in science. With my whole, I'm so sorry, I'm so froggy. I do believe in science completely. I believe in not any one of its particular insights or in its ability to find absolute truth, but I believe in the methodology, which is this error-correcting mechanism, relentless, unflinching. And it's, to me, a kind of spiritual discipline with a kind of devoutness unprecedented in our history. This great mechanism, which has given us everything you see around you. Yes, you wouldn't want to use the toilet paper of the Renaissance, although it might have been some kind of wonderful silken or cotton, discarded fabric or something like that. It could have been better than what we have now, but that's just technology. But if you have the chance to talk to some of the great minds of the Renaissance, the great scientific minds of the Enlightenment, we would want to talk to them today as much as we would want to talk to anyone. It's not as if Einstein annihilates Newton. As Neil Tyson has often said so brilliantly, he expands what Newton knew. He takes what Newton knew and then makes that region much greater, and it continues. It's an endless road. And it's also a permanent revolution. And that's what's so great about it. That's the great political dream that is yet to be fulfilled. The creation of a society which is permanently revolutionary. Our society is only a couple of 100 years old, and already, still many of us are willing to betray, with every day, its most fundamental values. And so we have a senator who calls himself a Democrat, who's willing to look aside as a person who aspires to be the highest law enforcement officer in the land. Says he doesn't know torture when he sees it. And that's the kind of the error-correcting mechanism of the Constitution, which is another brilliant machine. It hasn't failed. but our ability to take it to heart and to make it influence our actions, we have failed. And it's a source of tremendous heartbreak that we are living in a time when the law has been abandoned. We have a president reach the widest number of people and do our best to communicate the values and the methods of science so that people will be responsive when they're lied to and have some kind of reaction to that. We have many buttons that are easily pushed. That's our evolutionary baggage. And the only antidote I know, both to being manipulated in this fashion, is our knowledge of science. So, I'm sorry.
So that's why science, and I'd like to ask you and the other panelists, maybe beginning with Neil Tyson, how does learning science, this panel discussion, science in the public, how does learning science pay off for me or for the average Joe on the street? There are economic benefits for society when we learn science, that's obvious, but is that the only reason why scientists wring their hands about scientific literacy? What are some of the other kinds of payoffs? Neil Tyson?
Yeah, thanks. This enterprise we call science, I think, might be mislabeled. If you call it science, then people get to say, oh, that's science, I'm going to do something else. Maybe we should recall the enterprise of science reality, okay? Because I say this not just to get an applause, but I'll take it if you got it. In the previous panel, it was mentioned that perhaps science is not the way to answer all questions. Maybe that would be scientism, but the methods and tools certainly have demonstrated themselves as being the most successful way to come to understand reality there ever was. But there's an aspect of science that went uncommented upon, which may be its most fundamental, and that is its capacity, without equal, to remove as far as possible our own urges to delude ourselves. That is the fundamental element of a scientific process. It is the tacit recognition that we are faulty, our five senses are faulty data-taking devices, and they need help. And so while you can never fully divorce the read of the experiment from your senses, what you can do is sort of narrow the likelihood that your senses have interfered with your interpretation until you sort of asymptotically hit some level where you then step back and say, that's reality. And so the value of science is not simply what next model of iPod you will buy next week. The value
Although that's great.
It is good. I got one right on my hip here, okay? We're good. But its real value comes about when it's time to distinguish reality from everything else. And to be scientifically literate is to be trained in what it is to recognize your own frailty as a data-taking, data-interpreting device. So science's value goes far beyond just the technologies that make life better. They transfer into other walks of life when it's time to assess what is right and what is not, to make informed decisions about your life, about the lives of others, loved ones, and even the geopolitics of what it is to conduct life in the world today.
Question for Richard Dawkins on this point. Might be controversial in front of this audience because we're all motivated by his recent bestseller, The God Delusion, but my favorite of your titles, Richard, is Unweaving the Rainbow, and in it you argue, I think beautifully, that learning science isn't just to get a better job or because of the technological benefits, but that learning the scientific outlook, steeping yourself in that, it enriches your life. Does the sales pitch that scientists need to make in order to foster a more widespread appreciation of science have to include that kind of competition with other worldviews that many people find enrich their lives?
There are two main justifications for science, and one of them, I suppose, is the utilitarian one, that it's useful, and people will justify saving rainforests because you can get medicines from tree bark and things like that. But I agree with what you've just said, that there's something much more important, which is the sort of poetic benefit of science. The utilitarian benefits of science are not a good enough reason. I think it's rather like, I've used this example before, it's rather like saying that the point about music is that it's good exercise for the violinist's right arm. Science is much more like music in the sense of the aesthetic appreciation of music. And just as you don't have to learn an instrument like the violin in order to appreciate music at a very high level, so you can appreciate science and you can enjoy science and you can feel the thrill of the aesthetic thrill of science without actually being a scientist. So you don't have to have made a youthful study of the Bunsen burner in order to appreciate the music of the spheres, the majesty of the heavens, the majesty in another sense of the geological record, the sheer age of the rocks, the immense complexity of a single living cell, let alone the immense complexity of the trillions of living cells that is each one of you. So,
And you.
and me. So, I suppose that what Neil was talking about is kind of intermediate between the violinist's right arm, the utilitarian, mundane value of science, and the Carl Sagan sort of poetic value of science. The advantage of the scientific way of thinking, of not getting a cockeyed view of the world in which you find yourself. Science has developed methods of avoiding fooling yourself. Scientists are not necessarily more honest people than anybody else, but the methods of science have honesty built into them. We have peer review, we have the necessity for experiments to be repeated before they're taken seriously. We have the virtue of inter-observer correlation. It shouldn't matter who does the experiment. If the experiment is done in Japan or America or India, if the experiment's done properly, it should get the same result. Scientists don't appeal to authority. That kind of correct view of reality, as opposed to a tradition view of reality or a revelation view of reality, that seems to me to be a third virtue of science, which lies intermediate between the violinist's right arm on the one hand and the Carl Sagan in the upper stratosphere of poetry.
Annie, you had a comment.
Yeah, there's another value to science, and that is that science is the only discipline of which I know that has been able to wean us of our spiritually narcissistic need to be at the center of the universe. And so science has done something so profound to us, both in what I would call a philosophical and religious worldview. Without science, we go along in this kind of infantile belief that we are the center of the universe, the crown of creation, that we were created by God separately from the rest of nature. And that has had a very powerful effect, so that even people who would consider themselves conventionally religious, if they are conventionally religious, it requires them to ignore the 400 billion suns and the retinues of 100 worlds that circle those suns each, and the billions of galaxies, and to recognize that all of that constitutes merely 4% of the universe. The rest of it is enshrouded in dark matter, 96% unknown to us at this point. So it's very hard when, in our traditional religious scriptures, when they talk of God creating the world, it's a God who's earthbound and who is oblivious to the rest of creation. We only know that because of science.
A number of the panelists are formal science educators. I'd like to ask Vic Stanger, who has a background as a formal science educator, what are some of the roadblocks? And in fact, the whole panel, I'd like to discuss roadblocks. If we're all on the same page, I'm sold, you guys have persuaded me, science is for everyone, we should get into it. What's stopping widespread appreciation?
Well, I taught university physics for 37 years, and when I look back at it now, I think I would do it entirely differently. But yet I'm not sure how I would do it, because I think the big problem that we have in science education is we just do not teach science well. The impediment, one of the impediments I had was I was forced, certainly when I was teaching introductory physics courses, the great bulk of the students were engineering students. And they were there to be trained. They had to learn certain things to be able to move on to the next level. And I always felt we never had a chance to really talk about what physics was all about. And when I tried to do that, there was no interest in it. It was just, the students sat there, you know, oh, is this going to be on the test? And one of the aspects of science that we're supposed to emphasize is critical thinking. And I don't know where in a science curriculum anybody learns any critical thinking. My wife Phyllis here, who taught English, did a better job of teaching critical thinking in her English classes, in the essays that she had to grade, and made sure that the students, when they wrote these essays, had a basis for what they were saying. And we never had that opportunity. We were just asking them, showing them how to solve problems. I would practically take, for the freshmen, I would take them up to the blackboard in my office and practically take them by the hand to show them how to draw a picture and state what's given and state what you have to find and look for the right equation and check it, how to check the equation. And yet, that's how we train scientists. I guess the point is that what we were doing, we're training people to be either engineers or scientists. And even when we taught the courses for non-science majors, and there are a lot of textbooks out there to choose from, and almost every one of those books are just basically teaching watered down calculus physics, physics without calculus. The lower the level, the Physics 100, the lowest level physics course would be with a lot of cartoons and with drawings and so on, but there was still the same subject matter. You had to go through the same subject matter, just at a much lower level. And I think if I had to do it over again, I'd try to do it some other way.
Neil.
Victor, I think you're under recognizing the value of your life experience in those roles. Let me offer anecdotal, though it is, reflections on just your point. People who are in school and maybe in a physics class, and perhaps they don't want to become a physicist or an engineer, they'll say, why do I have to learn about a frictionless pulley on an inclined plane with a massless? I mean, how will I ever use this? And in fact, you will never in your life encounter a frictionless pulley on a massless pulley on a frictionless inclined plane. Never, ever will that ever come up. Yet it's a physics problem in the physics book. And so I understand this, of course. However, there's something else going on there that we forget as educators, and particularly as physics educators. And that is, in order to solve the problem in the first place, there's a new wiring of the brain that gets connected. And even after you forget the details of having solved the problem, the wiring in the brain that was established to have solved the problem lingers on. And I see this in the minds of adults. For example, Richard Holbrooke, who you may remember is the American ambassador to the UN during Clinton, he's a neighbor of the American Museum of Natural History, where it's my day job. up there, in case you didn't know, at the Hayden Planetarium. He wanted to take a tour of the newly built Rose Center at Hayden Planetarium right after we built it. And so I build the place, I give the guy the tour. And I start describing the moon, the planets, the stars, and he starts asking questions. And he says, is it true that if the moon is aligned this way, you get this phase before this eclipse takes place? I said, well, yeah, actually, yeah. We're walking around, and he says, well, if this galaxy rotates, do the stars move through the gas clouds, or is it all one? Oh, well, actually, it goes this way, and you trigger star. And he's asking questions deep in the content. And I say, now wait a minute, you're like a politician. You're a negotiator in the Balkans. Where does this, what? And he said, so I took physics when I was in college, before I shifted over into international law. And then it was just plainly obvious that this man had solved frictionless pulley problems, because he knew how to get to the essence of a problem. And then I asked him, how does that reveal itself in the negotiating table? You as a politician, how does this show? He said, you know immediately who's basically full of it and who isn't. Because they're constructing alternative realities that have no foundation in the real reality. And so Victor, don't give up on yourself too quickly. All right.
Yeah. I should mention that I grew up in this area, and when I was about 15, my mother took me to the Hayden Planetarium. It was around 1950 or something like that. And that really got me into science. So Neil, you did a great job. But yeah, you're right, and I have to admit that there's something happening in the process. I'm just claiming that the people who are coming out are still not thinking critically the way we want. Why is it that so many of them, for example, still will come out of the science education and still believe in religion? I mean, it's just, is there when you walk into a church, is there a place there where you leave your brains, deposit brains here? And it's something I think we've all had to puzzle about.
Richard.
In biology education, we have very much the same kind of problems, but we have one massive additional problem, which is that the central theorem of biology is evolution. And in the case of evolution, well, there are, of course, difficulties in understanding evolution, which are genuine difficulties, which are comparable to those in understanding physics. In order to really understand evolution, you have to get your mind around incomprehensible time spans. Nobody can really grasp what 1 million years means, let alone what 100 million years means, because our brains on the Pleistocene of Africa were geared to understanding time spans of seconds, minutes, hours, days, years, decades, maybe at most centuries. We can't cope with 1 million years, we certainly can't cope with 100 million years, and yet you've got to, or you won't understand evolution. Similarly, there's a tremendous interference put up by the fact that we are an artifact-creating species, and therefore, when we see a mechanism like an eye, a biological mechanism like an eye, our mind instantly leaps to artifacts, and we instantly think there has to be a maker. And these are all legitimate difficulties which are soluble by patient explanation, and I've devoted my whole adult life to try to provide such explanations. But we have to face the fact that in the case of evolution, we have one massive roadblock to education, and that is religion. Because in the case of evolution, I think almost uniquely in science, maybe the Big Bang is subject to similar problems, we have a competing worldview which is actively engaged in a political process of deliberate subversion of the educational process. And so Whereas a physicist who's trying to get across the charms of balls sliding down inclined planes, etc., has the ordinary problems of education and yet students wondering whether it's going to be on the test. Biologists have all that problem as well, but they have the additional problem that the student will say, oh, I don't believe that because I'm a, you name it, Muslim or Catholic or whatever. I was on, sorry.
No.
I was on I was visiting a school a few days ago doing a filming project and was talking to these children they were 15 or 16-year-olds about evolution. And time and again I would get somebody who would say, oh, well, I know that's what we're told in school, but I don't believe that because I'm a Muslim. It says in the Quran, or it says in the Bible. And I put it to them straight, do you mean to say that if the evidence says so-and-so, and your holy book, whichever one it happens to be, says the opposite, you mean you prefer your holy book over the evidence? And they said, of course we would. There was no question about it. 15, 16.
And where were we?
In England, in London. There was one young man who was raised Muslim, and he was totally close-minded. More than just close-minded in the ordinary way that any of us might be close-minded. His mind had been systematically closed by an educational process in early childhood, and it's a massive additional barrier that we have to face as educators in the field of evolution.
So is it consensus of all the panelists that among the many challenges to science education, political ideologies, postmodernism, some brands of feminism maybe, that religion deserves the biggest bullseye? Neil, maybe?
I have to make a quick agreement with Richard here. At the planetarium, we have a tandem projection space where we recreate the first few moments of the universe in what we call the Big Bang experience. And of course, this is part of a larger museum of natural history. And occasionally, I'm confronted by a religious person who asks, well, where is the religious view of the beginning of the universe? And so, rather than actually engage them in that conversation, I send them over to the Hall of Evolutionary Biology, and then they never come back. They never make it back to me. Because in those halls we have chimpanzees holding hands with human skeletons, and so they just never show up again. So forgive me, but I'm sending them all over to you. But I'm sorry, the question?
Just that, while it appears there's consensus that religion deserves the biggest bullseye in terms of it being the biggest impediment to science education, but there are other...
Well, I forgot to mention postmodernism, I mean, there is a kind of view which is being put about in social science and arts departments of universities, that there's nothing special about science, and science is just one version of truth, and your version of truth is just as good as my version of truth, and we all decide what's true for us, and never mind about evidence. Who says evidence is important? Isn't evidence just a white male supremacist concept anyway?
So we've talked about, and maybe not at length, given the time constraints, but some of the challenges facing widespread appreciation of science. I'd like to talk about some solutions. And
may I just mention one additional challenge besides religion, and that is popular culture, which depicts the scientist as the misfit and the guy who's out to destroy everything that's precious to all of us. And it's not just that kind of Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Faustus, Dr. Strangelove kind of problem, Jurassic Park, that kind of thing, but it's also, and this is not strictly a religious view, and I think it's more of a popular cultural view, or even a psychological problem, and that is that we're afraid to tell our children that they will die someday. And so in infancy, in childhood, toddlers, as soon as they ask us these deep questions, most parents, I think, are really afraid to say, yes, you will die someday. And I think that perpetually infantilizes people so that they grow up with this core belief that is an obstacle, this magical thinking that is an obstacle, not only to having a great life and living in the present and realizing that this world is our paradise. This is the place that we were made for by evolution, but also a kind of resistance to science as something that's a lot of bad news, you know? And that really, it's like every, American movies, not all of them, but mostly, they're always saying, you just gotta believe. If you just want it bad enough, you can make it happen. Things that are impossible can happen. And so it's a kind of popular culture religion that we're up against, which says that science is boring, and then of course the educational system comes in and supports that contention at every opportunity. And so people don't think that science is for them. And that's a great tragedy, and that's something that I think is perhaps as big an obstacle as orthodox religious ideology.
Vic Stenger, a quick rejoinder, and then we'll talk about some solutions maybe.
Well, it's not a rejoinder to that point, but there was something I wanted to add about the whole science-religion issue that came up actually in the previous panel. The common statement that you hear, where did the universe come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? Where did the laws of physics come from? These are all questions that I think science is now in a position to answer. A very simple reason is for why there's something rather than nothing is that from our own experiences with physical phenomena, nothing seems to be a very unstable system, a state where there's just total symmetry, such as a raindrop will tend to naturally become something more complex. And so there's an answer to the question, a very simple answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that is that nothing is unstable. Nothing is not the most natural state. Something is the more natural state of existence.
Yeah, but Victor, okay, but I'm okay with that, but even if we didn't yet have an answer to it, we should not be ashamed of not having answers to all questions yet. So you shouldn't somehow take the list of questions that the religious community poses to science and say, well, what was around before the Big Bang, and there were this and after death, and I say, I don't know yet, and go on to the next problem. And I'm perfectly happy staring somebody in the face saying, I don't know yet. And we got top people working on it. And so the moment you feel compelled to provide an answer, then you're doing the same thing that the religious community does, providing answers to every possible question. By the way, what science also does is not only answer well-posed questions, it also can put you in a position to judge whether, in fact, the question has meaning in the first place. And just because you put nouns and verbs in the right sequence doesn't mean your question has to have any sense at all. If you ask, what is the square root of a pork chop? That doesn't... At what temperature does the numeral 7 melt? Just because you ask that question doesn't obligate me to say, hey, let's fund the lab to answer it. And so science inquiry is also, half of that effort is constructing the questions in the first place.
Let's spend the remaining couple minutes talking about some solutions. Vic mentioned earlier going to the Hayden Planetarium. Young turned him on. You have the story about how influential that experience was in your life. Quick question about informal science education.
Which, by the way, is in my memoir, which apparently is for sale outside. I've heard some other books talked about in the previous memoir.
Which is for sale and autographed out waiting for you. In Japan, in all of Asia, there's a very small number, single digits number of informal science education institutions, science centers, planetaria, yet they graduate a much higher number of science professionals. In North America, there's 150 or so planetaria, science centers, science museums, and we wring our hands about the lack of enthusiasm, the lack of interest in science. What gives? I'll ask first Neil, since he is Executive Director of Hayden Planetarium.
Sure. First of all, I think, Anne, I think it's not as bleak. It is bleak, but not as bleak as you indicated.
Oh, I don't think it's bleak at all.
Okay. No, in the sense that the portrayal of scientists in the media, there's a trend line where that is improving. Otherwise, you would not have sexy scientists, chemists, in other words, playing roles in the very lucrative CSI series, the Crime Scene Investigation, LA, Las Vegas, New York. Just if you watch television, check out that show one time. They are attractive people solving problems with science. There's also the very popular program Numbers, where, although it's a stretch sometimes, nonetheless, you have attractive people using mathematics to solve FBI problems. And so I just want to and not only that, we are entering a culture where the nerd has almost become a celebrated icon, where the richest person in the world is the patron saint of nerds. This is Bill Gates. So there's some hope that the celebration of what it is to be a geek and to have some deeper understanding of the physical world, people are a little bit warmer to that fact than I think they once were, but we have a long way to go. In terms of solutions, I think, I'm angry, by the way, even if I don't sound it at the moment. I gave a talk recently to the huge gathering of the National Science Teachers Association. Okay, love talking to teachers. It's my favorite audience. And these are educators. These are the people who have the future of our science literacy in their hands. And they're all members of this organization. And so at the beginning, I just asked for a show of hands. How many of you do not own a television? A fourth of their hands went up. Of those who own a television, how many don't ever really watch it, except maybe a movie they rent? Another fourth of the hands went up. Half of the audience does not watch television. Yet 99% of America watches television. And so, how can you call yourself an educator without knowing what the forces are operating on the person who it is you're trying to educate? And I charge them with it. I'm not saying they have to become TV junky couch potatoes, but you should have some understanding. And the next educator who says, the students, they just don't want to learn, when this science is not for everyone, that is a pedagogically lazy sentence. That is the educator who refuses to actually meet the person halfway or even 90% of the way to understand what keys will unlock the understanding of the audience. So I submit that half of the effort is not just complaining about how come no one cares anymore, it's reinvigorating a community of educators who will actually make the effort to go there and meet the people on their own turf.
A question for Richard Dawkins on this point regarding mass media communication of science to the public. You're a professor of the public understanding of science. There are many new technological innovations to get science education out there. YouTube, podcasts, your website's very popular. Neil deGrasse Tyson has this wonderful lecture series with the Teaching Company out there on the universe, my favorite universe. Does that medium limit science education? Do you have to water things down too much or put things in soundbite form that makes science education kind of weaken?
Well, first, I don't believe that a quarter of the teachers don't own televisions. I think they're lying. The culture requires. I am enthusiastic about technological aids to teaching. They can, of course, go too far, and we've all sort of moaned about the PowerPoint addict who has things whizzing around. And it can be positively distracting. Some of the, you were talking earlier about exhibition centers and science fairs and things like planetariums and the Exploratorium, is it called, in San Francisco. I watch children in the Exploratorium, and there's a similar one in Bristol in England, and I get the feeling that actually they're not really learning very much science. I mean, they're rushing around pressing buttons and rushing to the next one to get the reinforcement of seeing some action when you go and press a button. Something, it's a bit like a pigeon in a Skinner box or something. You press a button and something happens. The other thing I've noticed about those about such places is that there is an emphasis on trying to stimulate the senses in all sorts of ways. There are bangs and crashes and flashes and coloured lights, and there's an exhibition that goes on in England called Exploding Custard. I'm not sure what it is. It's some kind of a scientific experiment. And it's a constant emphasis on science as fun. Science has got to be fun, or it's not palatable, it won't be imbibed by the young people. There is fun in science, but it's also hard work. And so we mustn't lose sight of the hard work that goes into learning science when we are trying to make it fun, and when we're putting on PowerPoint presentations and having visual aids and auditory aids of all kinds. I sometimes feel that one of the most rewarding experiences that I know of is trying to convey to children the sheer scale of the universe, and by doing it, there's a very nice American children's book that's been produced, which invites them to go out onto a football pitch and lay up a soccer ball in the middle of the pitch to represent the sun, and then to scale, you then walk a certain number of paces to place, first of all, a pinhead representing Mercury, and then a slightly larger, I don't know, a pea or something to represent Venus, and then Earth, and then Mars, and then what would be a ping pong ball, or ping pong ball to represent Jupiter, etc. And then you get to the outer planets, and by then you're a couple of hundred yards away from the soccer ball. And then how far would you have to go in order to put down another soccer ball for the next star, Proxima Centauri? And the book says, pack a lunch. You're going to be walking 2,000 miles on that scale. And the children's eyes they just devour that. I mean, they light up. They don't need exploding custard. You can do it with words. You can do it with words. If the subject matter is the real subject matter of science, it is that this is coming back to the poetic view of science at a children's level. So I tend to shy away from bangs and crashes and flashes and exploding custard, and try to do something like the Carl Sagan approach of explaining the wonder of reality, because these children, they are placed in reality. What an amazing experience that they've been granted by the astonishing statistical luck of having been born. No child should ever say, I'm bored, because how could you be bored when you find yourself living in this world against stupendous odds? That's the kind of thing that I think you can convey in words, and with some help from technology, but don't let's get over-seduced by it.
Continuing our focus on solutions to the problems the panelists have identified, if there is consensus that religion is a major impediment to widespread science education, I'd like to ask Annie and then open it up to the rest of the panelists and try to have some time for questions too. Does it help science educators and science enthusiasts and science advocates to emphasize that point? Should we be rubbing everyone's nose in it that religion is the big doozy, that it is the major problem?
Of course not. We should conduct ourselves with respect and kindness and give science a good name by being open and listening to what other people have to say, people who disagree with us vehemently. I feel that very strongly. We have a better story to tell. The great story of the universe as revealed by science in our time is so much more spiritually uplifting. The idea that each and every one of us comes from as part of an unbroken chain that goes back nearly 4 billion years. That, in fact, we make new people by exchanging the secret of life within us with the person we love most, if we're fortunate. And at that moment of ecstatic communion, what happens? this ancient message, this ancient secret of life, combines to create a new being who has never been before. This is a better story than any religious story.
Well, of course it's a better story, but I don't know, when you have an actual organized opposition which actually fights you and tries to stop you telling your story,
keep telling
then I think you've got to fight back. I'm not sure that it's enough just to quietly go on about what a wonderful story you've got to tell.
Richard, may I finish? May I finish? Okay? Actually, in the end, I think that the fighting back may be counterproductive, really. I mean, obviously, stand up. Don't be silenced. Fight for the right to teach science in school and not fantasy stories. And to give our children science. Fight for those things, obviously. But the fact is that when we connect with another person, whether it's through television or on YouTube or wherever, when we connect with another person, when we open up their minds, when we get them to take what science is saying to heart and not just compartmentalize it as a collection of amazing facts, but instead something which is a kind of spiritual leap, which is the result of all the generations. When we do that, we have a chance of making real change. You know, the fact is that there are scientists who are religious. Now, that baffles me, conventionally religious. This really baffles me. But it tells me also that there is a part of ourselves, the religious part, which is sometimes not amenable to logic. The story you were telling about your sister is that people can maintain these internal inconsistencies without having any problem with it. So we're not going to reach them by telling them they're stupid and that they shouldn't do this. We're going to reach them by breaking through with some idea, some insight, some act that will permeate that resistance. And we're not going to do it with everyone. I look at YouTube. Look at how many, there's something like, I don't know, thousands of little bits of Cosmos on YouTube. Some of them viewed 500,000 times. Cosmos has never been off the air since it was first broadcast in 1980. It is in 40 languages. It's on television right now somewhere in the world. It's a good question, why in 27 of the most eventful years in the history of science, where so much new has been discovered, why is a 27, 30-year-old series still so popular? It's because, I think in large measure, because the way Carl was presenting what he had to say, not as if you don't know this, and if you don't believe this, you're an idiot. No, it was bringing people into this great story of how we found out who we are, when we are, and where we are in the universe. So I think the kinder, the more patient, and the more thoughtful we can make ourselves be, the better chance we have of setting an example of how science speaks. Science is temperate. Scientists don't burn people at the stake. Scientists don't put people in jail, or they shouldn't, for believing things that they disagree with. Scientists are flawed, and the community of science has a lot to answer for. But if we are true to our values, we will not do those things.
Thank you, Anne. It's my job to make sure that all the panelists have time to really respond to this question, and we'll get to all the panelists in turn. Vic Stanger, would you like to respond to that about rubbing everyone's nose in it?
Right. Now, I don't think that the only alternative to rubbing everyone's nose in it is to rub your own nose in it and to kowtow to religion just because you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings or the deeply held belief, offend their deeply held beliefs. Now, there are a couple of things that scientists now do that I disagree very strongly with. You take the National Academy of Sciences, for example. Only 7% of them, according to a poll of a few years ago, believed in a personal God. And yet, they came out with a statement, one of their statements on evolution, where they said that science has nothing to say about the supernatural. So science has nothing to say about God. And this was picked up, I know, in the trial, the Dover evolution case. The judge made similar statements, that science has nothing to say. Science only deals with the natural, it doesn't deal with the supernatural. And that's just total nonsense. Science does have something to say about the supernatural. There are good scientists out there doing studies on the efficacy of prayer, for example, right in front of the noses of National Academy of Sciences. And furthermore, I think that we do ourselves a great disservice by saying that science only deals with natural phenomena. This plays right into the hands of people like Philip Johnson, who says says that science promotes materialism. And is dogmatically opposed to any alternative to materialism or naturalism. And I insist that science isn't dogmatically opposed to anything. Science is something that relies on observation. And if the data were to show evidence for the supernatural, evidence for God, I've used the prayer example before. If they did very careful studies in prayer that showed that only Catholic prayers worked and nobody else's worked. No, Muslim prayers didn't work, Jewish prayers didn't work, Protestant prayers didn't work, Hindu, just Catholic prayers. Well, I couldn't find a plausible natural explanation for that. I mean, I was raised as a Catholic. I'm already baptized, so it'd be very easy for me to get back in. Just walk down to the nearest church, go into the confessional and say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 50 years since my last confession." In other words, I think we could find a middle ground between rubbing anybody's noses, our own or anybody else's, in the dirt. We can argue rationally with them. We can promise not to be dogmatic. We can promise to go wherever the data lead.
Neil Tyson and then Richard Dawkins.
I just have a brief reaction to that. I try to put a line in the sand just because it's, I think, more effective. And that is, let me give it by example. We all heard from Matthew LeClaire last night, receiving a standing ovation. Is he here in the audience? There he goes. You got a standing ovation. Why? Because he himself stood up for what he knew was a breach of trust, really, of the role of the teacher in a classroom. And here with recordings and transcripts of the teacher saying that Jesus has to be your savior, otherwise you'll go to hell. And that was packaged in with other statements that Noah's Ark carried dinosaurs, and that the Big Bang and evolution were just theories and optional and could discard them. In my letter to the New York Times, which, in response to that, because I try to stay out of that, because we got enough folks out there. I don't need to be the N+1th person to comment on these things. Everyone said separation of church is a violation of the First Amendment, and I just thought about it, and an ACLU got in, and I said it's got nothing to do with the separation of church and state, actually. And what I did was I cited not whether you're going to heaven or hell because you believe in Jesus, because I actually have very little to say about that. But what I did say was, if you're going to say that you need a separation of church and state in this case, my comment was, if the guy's saying that Noah had dinosaurs on his ark, and that evolution and the Big Bang are just theories, then the problem is not the separation of church and state. It's the separation of scientifically illiterate, ignorant people from the ranks of teachers. That was my 5-line letter to the editor. But I did so not mentioning in those 5 lines, you're going to go to heaven or hell or Jesus, because I don't care about that, really. But it is demonstrably false that people hung out with dinosaurs. And if Noah is a person, he did not have dinosaurs on his ark. Okay? So I only cited those things for which there's the evidence. Okay? But if you want to say, if Jesus is your Savior, you'll go to heaven, okay, then talk about separation of church and state. Otherwise, get the demonstrably false stuff out of the classroom. So that's where I draw the line, and I find it to be much more effective, because otherwise you get entangled in all the rest of the baggage that comes with the religion, when in fact there's a cleaner, if you separate the variables, there's a cleaner track to take. Now, I admire those who want to take up the whole package, but I can't count myself among them. Life is too short.
Richard Dawkins.
I never know what I think. I sort of feel I agree with what Neil has said on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. It's a genuinely hard question, and I think it's partly what's the right political approach to this kind of problem. I don't have much time for NOMA, for non-overlapping magisteria, the idea that religion and science are doing two quite separate things, and they can get on with their religion as long as they don't trespass on our lawn and we get on with our thing. And I agree with Victor that there's that things like the existence of a supernatural creator, that actually is a scientific issue. It's not something you can say, well, I just aesthetically prefer to believe that there's a creator, but of course I'm a good scientist and I get on with my science during the week and then I go to church on Sunday. I really do think that there is a deep inconsistency, unless you... No, I stand by that. There really is a deep inconsistency. And so at least half the time I fight that corner. The other half I recognize that there's a political battle, especially in the United States, and Annie is right that for that kind of reason, and if Jeannie Scott were here, she would say the same thing, that for that kind of reason, we do have to make a political compact with the sort of decent, moderate, middle-of-the-road religious people who, whatever their faults, at least are on our side on the evolution matter. But it hurts, it sticks in my craw to do it.
Now, can I get it? The non-overlapping magisteria.
Yes.
Okay, way too many syllables. I think is as advanced, I guess, perhaps by Stephen Jay Gould, I think is actually a cop-out. If you look at the history of religion was not simply whether you believe in the supernatural. Your religious text made tacit experimental statements about the physical universe. And no one 500 years ago would have doubted whether there was a flood and that the universe was 6,000 years old. And that was part of the facts extracted from the Bible. So for those, I think, who claim that religion and science are separable, that's a latter-day recognition that science has already removed half of the claims that the Bible had made that were taken as truth 500 years ago. But so I therefore claim that the non-overlapping magisteria, while it's a bit of a shell game because they're accepting what is not yet shown to be false by science, the actual political battlefield is not what is left over in the religious text that people still want to believe. It's the stuff in the religious text, the claims in the religious text that step into the territory of what science can actually demonstrate to be true or false. And I think we agree there. Yeah. So Saturday.
Annie's asked just for one rejoinder. You want to comment?
Oh, well, I agree with Richard with all my heart that the non-overlapping magisteria is wrong, and it's just obviously logically wrong because, you know, the non-overlapping magisteria folk never say, well, let's not study Aztec religion scientifically and try to analyze whether or not their belief system had something to do with their agricultural practices and the reality, the sort of underlying economics of their situation. No, it's only the surviving religions that are supposed to be fenced off. And it's a kind of compact. And it's, you know, if you think of the great masters of the scientific revolution, the people who really gave us the most, they were all originally conventionally religious people, Newton, Kepler, even Darwin, to begin with. And it's possible that their insights, certainly in Kepler's case, overtly, was, he originally was inspired with the idea of reading the mind of God. So it was a great, it got him on his road, and his road was our road to the modern scientific revolution. So I agree with you completely. And I appreciate your courage, and I also appreciate the fact that you have kicked open a rotten door for all of us by standing up and being uncompromising. At a moment, it was almost as if there was this disgusting, repulsive blister of phony national piety that was very much related to the trauma of 9/11 and the piercing of our sense of invincibility and safety. And people resorted to the worst kind of, most reactionary kind of religious belief, and Richard came out and stood up and was willing to really take these people on and say, no, this is not true. So I'm in your debt, and I think it requires changing the mind of our civilization is going to require all of us doing everything we can in every way we know.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone a little over, and the last session went over a few minutes as well. We'll have time for one, maybe two, probably not two, one question. And the first question here at the, we'll have two questions. The first question at the microphone.
The Larry Summers question. What's up with tricks in science?
Slightly off topic, nonetheless interesting. Yeah.
It's science education.
Yeah, right. Does anyone want to field maybe if there are genetic differences between men and women that explain why more men are in science? Anyone want to touch that?
I've never been female. But I have been black my whole life. And so let me perhaps offer some insight from that perspective, because there are many similar social issues related to access to equal opportunity that we find in the black community as well as the community of women in a male-dominated, white male-dominated society. And I'll be brief because I want to try to get more questions. When I look at, throughout my life, I've known that I wanted to do astrophysics since I was 9 years old, a first visit to the Hayden Planetarium. I was a little younger than Victor at the time. I was, although he did it before I did. And so I got to see how the world around me reacted to my expression of these ambitions. And all I can say is the fact that I wanted to be a scientist and astrophysicist was hands down the path of most resistance through the forces of nature, forces of society. Anytime I expressed this interest, teachers would say, don't you want to be an athlete? Or don't you want to? I wanted to become something that was outside of the paradigms of expectation of the people in power. And so fortunately, my depth of interest in the universe was so deep and so fuel enriched that every one of these curveballs that I was thrown in, fences built in front of me, and hills that I had to climb, I just reached for more fuel and I kept going. Now here I am, I think, one of the most visible scientists in the land, and I want to look behind me and say, well, where are the others who might have been this? And they're not there. And I wonder what is the blood on the tracks that I happened to survive that others did not, simply because of the forces of society that prevented at every turn, to the point where I have security guards following me as I go through department stores, presuming that I'm a thief. I walked out of a store one time, and the alarm went off, and so they came running to me. I walked through the gate. At the same time, a white male walked through the gate, and that guy just walked off with the stolen goods, knowing that they would have stopped me and not him. That's an interesting sort of exploitation of this, what a scam that was. I think people should do that more often, all right?
I'm shopping with you.
So my life experience tells me that when you don't find blacks in the sciences, you don't find women in the sciences, I know that these forces are real, and I had to survive them in order to get where I am today. So before we start talking about genetic differences,
Right.
you gotta come up with a system where there's equal opportunity, then we can have that conversation.
And we'll have another question and please direct it to one of the panelists.
Well, this really isn't a question. I just want to let everybody know. My name's Emily Kingsley, and for the last 38 years I've been writing scripts for Sesame Street and starting kids off in the very beginnings of their educational life with certain attitudes. In addition to our curriculum goals of trial and error, asking questions, observation, experimentation, I just want to let you know that next Tuesday we have a major curriculum seminar to prepare ourselves for the big 40th season coming up, which is going to get a lot of press. And the major curriculum push for the 40th season is going to be environmentalism, conservationism, and a real treasuring of our planet. So I'm here to tell you that I represent all of us here today in that room, and you have the commitment of everybody who works for Sesame Street to start our kids off in the most investigative and appreciative way of nature and science. And we are totally committed to that, and in addition to that, of course, we're totally committed to gender neutrality and giving all children of all genders, however many there may be, equal exposure and opportunity to love and cherish this amazing planet, and their brains and their minds and their ability to learn and enjoy their lives.